We're talking about the book of Titus, God's way in a wayward world. And not too long ago, I was in the grocery store and was going down one of the aisles, and I saw a young mother there who had her baby inside the basket. It was in a car seat, but you know how they do now. They place it in the basket, and they're going down the aisle. And they, of course, we used to sit in there. Do you still see any kids sitting in that basket anymore? Yeah, probably the most dangerous place in the whole grocery store is that thing. And now they have seat belts and everything else. They've really kind of learned their lesson about that. But this lady, she had a baby in the basket in front of her, and she had two young boys that were following along behind her. And as she's walking slowly along, she's scanning the shelves for whatever she needs. And I noticed that one of the little boys was right behind her, and he was taking his front lead foot and he was placing it in the exact same space that his mother's back foot had just come out of. And she was following her mother just like that, step by step, very close. And of course, the little brother or whoever it was, the other little boy that was with him, was doing it to him. And so there they are going down the aisle of the grocery store, stepping in each other's space. And then all of a sudden, Mom stops. And guess what happens? Boom. It was like a train wreck, literally, inside the aisle. And of course, the mom turned around and said something like, "Watch where you're going," you know, and the young boy turned around and said, "Watch where you're going," to the other. And I'm sitting here taking all of this in, and it just really occurred to me that everybody leads somebody at some point in your life. Everybody leads somebody else at some point in your life. If you are old enough to hear and understand the words of my voice, then you have probably, without knowing it, already began leading somebody. If you are an older sibling, then you have already began leading your younger sibling along. Sometimes your younger sibling is leading you along, depending on what's going on. We just saw how mothers have tremendous amount of influence in their kids' lives and leading. Mothers have influence in the sense of teaching their kids how to dress, how to talk, how to eat, how to keep their hands to themselves, how to love, how to forgive. All of these things, as a mother, you're doing that. If you're an employer, you've already began leading. Sometimes if you're an employee, you've already began leading people. And the reason for this, the reason that everybody at some point in their life is going to lead somebody else is because leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is not about being the boss. Leadership is not about being over somebody. Leadership is influence. I love what Chuck Swindoll says. Leadership is influence to the degree in which you influence someone, you lead them. You lead them. Leadership is influence. One of the ways I can see how this really works out is even as a neighbor, you can have influence over other neighbors. Denise we are on the HOA board of our association, and I'm on the architectural committee board, and we have noticed that whenever one neighbor does something in the yard, you can look around and pretty soon somebody else is going to do the same thing. We have, like some time ago, we had somebody who docked their tree very closely down, cut all the limbs off, and it died. But we noticed that because this person done that, we saw all of these other trees in the neighborhood. People got this wild idea, well, I'll cut mine down. Well, you know what? In our HOA, you have to replace that tree. You can't have a dead tree in your front yard. And it's just amazing the influence that even as a neighbor you have with people. People would paint their house like some weird color. And of course, that's a no-no where we live. You can't paint your house yellow. Might be great where you want and where you live, but you can't do it in our neighborhood. Another observation about leadership is that it is always taking people somewhere. It's not static. Leadership, you're always moving. The very nature of leadership is movement because of the fact that you are moving forward. The movement is also not intended, is often not going in the direction that you intended as well. Sometimes the direction you want to go is in a completely different direction. And even if you do not lead, that is going to take somebody somewhere. A lack of direction takes people somewhere, because leadership always takes some people somewhere. And so how does this affect our spiritual life? How does this affect your spiritual walk? If you're always going to be leading somebody at some point in your life, and your leading is always taking people somewhere, where are you leading people spiritually? Jesus talks about this directly in Luke chapter 6. Can the blind guide the blind? Won't they both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. Jesus understands this principle of influence, and he is cautioning his disciples here about who they allow to influence them. And in your life, you are either influencing someone, whether you know it or not. You are either influencing them by the decisions you make, the choices you make, the way that you live your life. You're always going to be influencing people somewhere towards God or somewhere away from God. Because leadership is influence, and you're all going to be a leader at some point in your life. So the question I want us to ask this morning is, are you a leader worth following? Are you a leader worth following? Because everyone leads somebody at some point, because leadership is always taking somebody somewhere. Am I a leader worth following? So we are going to be in the book of Titus. We're going to be beginning in chapter 5. And what we're going to do is we're going to read through, and then we're going to come back and we're going to analyze this verse. Not only did Jesus know that leadership is influence, but so did Titus. Titus knew that the key to having this church that he was starting on the island of Crete, or these churches rather, was that the leadership had to be in place, and that there were certain qualifications that were required for leadership. Because again, leadership is always going forward. Leadership is always taking you somewhere. And so Paul wanted to make sure that the leadership was not taking them into a ditch. And it's the same thing for churches today. All churches, the direction, the ministry of the church always ends and begins with leadership. And Paul knew this. And he knew that leadership was influence. And so he knew that primarily the leaders that needed to be selected in this church, in this fledgling church that Titus was being made responsible for, was going to have to be a good example as we go forward. We're going to begin in verse 5. The reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone, and as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, with faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. As an overseer of God's household, he must be blameless, not arrogant, not hot-tempered, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, not greedy for money, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled, holding to the faithful messages taught, so that he will be able to both encourage with sound teaching and refute those who contradict it. So if you look at this passage of scripture, you can see that I split it up into about 3 different parts. We have the need for spiritual leadership, the character of spiritual leadership, verses 6 through 9a, and the practice of spiritual leadership, verse 9. Let's look at the practice. The reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone, and as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town. So first thing we see here is that God works through leadership. It doesn't matter if it's good leadership or bad leadership. Leadership is whom God works through. And you see in this passage, Perhaps if it would quit doing that, it would. We see in this passage too that God raises up leaders. Whenever he tells him to raise up leaders here, you can tell that there were already leaders in Crete that they were to raise up. He says, don't go try and find them. What he says is appoint them. They're there. God has raised up leaders at all times. So make sure that you find them. So we're going through the whole sermon here just real quickly. So I don't know what you can do. So God works through leadership. Let's go ahead and look at the next section. The need for leadership. God works through leadership. The character of leadership. Look at verse 6. An elder must be blameless. An elder must be blameless. There's 3 areas in which he says it must be blameless. It must be blameless in his family life, blameless in his personal life, and blameless in his doctrinal life. Look what he says. That word blameless comes from the Greek word, it means ekleptos, and it simply means a person who is not subject to criminal activity. This is somebody who's considered innocent. It doesn't mean that somebody is sinless. It doesn't mean that somebody's perfect. Think about Moses. You remember Moses, what it said, he was blameless among all his contemporaries. So he was somebody who was not blameless, or he was not guilty. He was just somebody who was keeping short accounts with God. Is it doing it automatically? Okay, yeah. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's just go ahead and close that because it's distracting. And just leave it right there. We're just going to go just like this. Let me get set up here. Sorry, guys. This is part of it here. So when he talks about blameless, he's not talking about somebody who is without sin, because nobody would be able to do that, right? Blamelessness is talking about, do you keep short accounts with God? Is whenever you sin and whenever you come before God, and all of us do with shortcomings, are you ready to keep it right with God? Is there not an area in your life that is just glaringly obvious to not only you, to everyone around you, that there is this character flaw in your life? And so he explains it here as being blameless. He says, appoint them who are blameless, and it starts in his family life. He goes, are you the husband of one wife? And so oftentimes people have debated over the centuries really about exactly what does this mean. Does this mean that he had to be married? Does it mean that if he was married, he could only be married to one person at a time? Does it mean that somehow it cannot be divorced? Well, what about somebody if they're not married? It says that they must be the husband of one wife. So does that mean they have to be married, that single people are not allowed to do that? So there's a lot of different views on how this passage is understood, but I think the context is pretty clear. He's not really talking about their marriage status. What he's talking about is his family life and his relationships. And in fact, it literally means a one-woman man. A one-woman man. All of us have met guys to where they're not one-woman men. They are players, and you can tell them from a mile away. They think they're slick, but they're not. And just think of the type of influence that would have in a church. It would be devastating whenever the pastor is a playboy. And so he says, make sure that he's a one-woman man. This is somebody who's devoted to his wife. It doesn't mean that they don't get into arguments. Sometimes Denise and I, we still get into arguments, and we just kind of work it out, not with fists, but we just kind of work it out, and then we move on. But we work it out. We don't let, the sun go down on our anger too much. Sometimes we do, but we make it quick in the morning, right? So blamelessness in his family life is that he's somebody who is faithful to his wife, and he keeps the short accounts with both his wife and his family. And then the second verse, the second part of it, is that they have faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. And this one here also is understood in different ways. Some people believe that the children, the word's technos, and it means little children. This is not like, it's actually kind of a general word for kids. In fact, we use that today, don't we? We say, I have 5 kids, or I have 4 kids, or whatever the case is. It's the word for kids. And what he's talking about here, that word faithful, it's a very flexible term. It means faithful to what? Does it mean that they have to be believers? That doesn't seem right because really you can't force a child to believe one way or the other. At some point, they have to make a decision on their own whether or not they're going to believe. And if there's so many people down through the centuries to where their kids were unbelievers and they were still in leadership. It doesn't seem to say that. In the passage that Jim read earlier, it seems to indicate that are the children responsive to the leadership of the father in the home? Do they run the household? Imagine how difficult that would be to lead a church. Imagine I have little kids that are around here and I'm trying to lead the church and I have moral authority and we're going in this direction and my kids do what they want and they talk to me the way they want and they have no control, they have no respect for their father. And it's what he's talking about, that if you cannot even manage the kids of your own home, then how can you possibly manage a church? It's just going to be an obstacle to that. It's going to be an obstacle to the people that you're trying to lead, and it's going to be an obstacle to the watching world as well. And so he says that a leader must be blameless. His house, not perfect, but he's talking about, does he have the respect of his wife? Does he have the respect of their children? Do they follow his leadership? Because, as he goes on down, that they are not to be accused of wildness or rebellion. That idea is dissipation, just living insane and doing whatever they want. They know how to be in control. An overseer, he kind of changes the word there from elder to an overseer. It means a steward. Some of your translations may even say a steward. That's what a pastor or an elder, all of us collectively, are stewards. We're overseers. We're not dictators. We're not bosses. We're not any of those things. Is that we oversee the flock. And the overseer is one who is a manager of God's household. So if he can manage his own home, he might have at least a head start in being able to manage the church, because the same things happen in church that they do in the home, don't they? I don't know about you, but I know in some of the churches that I've been in and some of this churches, sometimes we act like children. And sometimes we have to be, of course, unfortunately, handled like children. There's bickering, there's all kinds, sometimes there's division, there's people who do this, people get into trouble, people leave, you can't find them, you come back, you call them, they come back. So it is really stewarding the house of God very much like a family would. And he uses that word again in verse 7. An overseer of God's household must be blameless, not arrogant. Not arrogant. Think about how arrogance can really hinder a pastor's ministry. Not arrogant, not hot-tempered. Somebody who just has a short fuse. You can't even really approach them with anything because they always blow it out of proportion. They're angry. They're hot-tempered. You have very little influence whenever you do. People don't want to be around you. They don't want to talk to you. They cannot be an excessive drinker. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's like, well, is he drunk today? Can we go in and talk to him today? You know, it's pretty bad when you have to go and help an elder into bed because they just don't know how to stand back away from the wine. And so this was in an area that's not unlike our culture today, that was ripe with all kinds of immorality and all kinds of excesses and all kinds of patterns of behavior that were absent of God. And he said, if we're going to get any group of people going in the right direction, we got to have the leadership is going to be an example. They're going to be sort of at least living the life that you're asking them to live. And that's with any of you as leaders. You have influence in people's lives. If you're a mother, you have influence in your life. You're either going to be leading them towards the things of God and what you say, do, and think, or you're going to be leading them away from God with your attitudes and the things that you say and the things that you do. It doesn't matter just be for elders. This is for all of us, because leadership is always taking somebody somewhere, and everybody at some point in their life is going to be a leader. What kind of leader are you? Are you a leader worth following? Because some leaders are not. In our culture today, you can get so high based on just sheer talent and luck and a catchy YouTube video. You can rise to the very pinnacle of leadership and influence in our culture. And I heard one person say that in our culture, unlike any other culture, is that you can rise to the very pinnacle of influence, but your character oftentimes determines whether you stay there or not. How many times have we seen politicians fail? Very charismatic, well-spoken, well-meaning politicians? How many sports people? I mean, just the very fact that you can slam a basketball and we raise them up to the echelon of a great leader is amazing in this country. That's the type of people we lift up. But God knows, Paul knows, that leadership is going to be an example. Leadership is going to be living a life that other people look at and go, wow, I want to do it like that. I want to be like Frank. I want to be like Dan. I want to be like Pastor John. I want to be like Doug. I see how he handles his family. I see how he interacts with his wife. He's not perfect. But I see how he interacts with her. I see how they kind of handle conflict. I see that. I want to do that. Maybe I can watch closely and see what they're doing to make this work. That example is so very important. And none of us will tell you that we're perfect in this. But it is the foundation of the church because there's so many people watching. So many people are watching what we say, watching what we do. They're watching how we respond. People are watching what you say. People are watching how you respond. You have influence in people, whether you know it or not. You're either influencing them for the good or influencing them for the bad. Not a bully. That's somebody that takes their authority and uses it against others. Somebody who's not a bully. Imagine how damaging and difficult it would be to follow somebody who's a bully. They're not really following you. You're driving them like cattle in many ways. You want them to follow. Not greedy for money, that goes without saying as well, is that they're never satisfied with the money. It's always got to be more. Their entire grid is sort of orientated and focused on the dollar, making the next money. What you want is somebody who's somewhat ambivalent towards money. If I make money doing this, great. If I don't make money, then great. Somewhat of ambivalence towards it. They see money as a tool. It's not really the end. It's a means, perhaps. Doesn't mean that they don't have money either. They can have plenty of money. Your spirituality is not determined by how much money you have. It's whether or not your money has you, right? Somebody who's not greedy for money, but hospitable. Hospitable. The word for Greek here is a lover of strangers. Philoxenos. We get that word xenophobia, right, from that word. It just means a lover of strangers. This is somebody who just is sociable, personable, likes people, wants to interact with people. There's nothing worse than having somebody who just generally doesn't like people. In those ways, I'm definitely not patting myself on the shoulder because they probably caught me in this noble deed rather than me doing it consistently. But I was in sales, and I was very successful in my ability to sell stuff. And so we had a big meeting, and they called me into the room, and there were a bunch of other sales guys and the sales manager there, and they asked me if I would tell the people how I was able to make people feel like they were liked. And I said, I really like them. How do you make people feel like they're liked? How do you, their idea was build rapport with them. How do you build rapport? I genuinely like them. You can't fake that. You can't. And if you do, it's only superficial and it's only for a short period of time. It's going to come out if you don't like people. So you genuinely have to like people. Doesn't mean you have to be a social butterfly, always in everybody's business, all over Facebook and all over doing that. That's not what he's talking about. But do you like people? Do you love people? Do you love people in spite of their challenges and in spite of their struggles? Do you still love them? Does your heart go out to them? Does their actions is not really going to be a metric by which you determine whether you're going to love them or not, right? Do you like people? Leadership. People got to know that you like them. If you don't like them, you can't be an elder. Elders, this is not even for all men. Only certain men can meet this qualification. And I think all of us who are elders in this church would admit that we're there by a hair's breadth on some cases. I heard somebody say that something, I don't know if I can remember it, but what they said was that, is that when people know that you want something for them rather than something from them, they're much more likely to allow you to confront them when you need to. Because when people know that you have something for them rather than something from them, they're much more likely to allow you to confront them when you need to. And that kind of segues into what we're about to talk about next. Be hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous. That word sensible is interesting. It simply means is that they look at situations, they look at things that occur, and they have the right perspective. They're able to translate that event well. They're either able to translate what happened or what people said or maybe what they did. You're able to translate it in a way that's kind of accurate to what's going on. They're sensible. You know when to shut up. You know when to talk. You know when to encourage somebody. You know when to actually give them an admonition. Sensible. You can read people. You can read what they're saying, maybe how they're feeling, those types of things. It's difficult sometimes to read people, especially if you don't know them. That's been my big challenge coming into a new group of people, is being able to read the conversations I have with some of you. So I know I've had some foibles, and so I ask for your forgiveness on that until I kind of learn, but that's going to happen. But the issue is, can you read people? Can you respond appropriately to these things? Hospitable, loving was good, sensible, righteous. Righteous. He does good things, does the right thing, makes good decisions. Is this the right thing to do? Should I not get a permit when I'm building this? Should I obey the speed limit? Did I say that out loud? There's one I got to work on. I confess that to you. I had a professor. He was very strict about obeying the speed limit. He would tell us, you need to obey the speed limit. That's God's rules. You need to make sure that you obey the laws of the land. It was so funny one day because he obeyed the rules, but one day leaving the school, it had like a gravel parking lot. And he was spinning his tires. And if the speed limit was 35, he'd go as quickly up to 35 as he could and then stop and then drive at 35. But he would be squealing the tires on the way to 35 half the time. But he would give directions on where he was going. And he would say, be very careful because that exit is only 35 miles an hour. So you have to start slowing down because it should be faster than that. I mean, that's how he was. And what a great guy. He did the right thing. And I watched that and I wanted to be that way. My wife's that person now. She goes, you're going a little fast. Don't you, some of you guys appreciate when your wife helps you? I love it. She's good at it. And I've learned to ask, where do you want to park, dear? Don't I do that? Where do you want to park? Just ask her. Get that out of the way right away. But they're righteous and holy. That means set apart. There are certain things that they just don't do. They guard their eyes by what we watch on television. There's nothing that goes into a man that makes him defiled, right? It's what comes out of a man that what makes him defiled. So watching a television program is not going to make you defiled, but it's who you are on the inside that's going to express itself. You don't do those things not because those things there make you unholy or they make you defiled. The very fact is that you're still undone. You still have the flesh. And those things are opportunities that will bring out the worst in you out of you. And so you're holy. You put boundaries on what your eyes go across. You put boundaries on what you'll listen to. There's certain conversations that you have to not get involved with because that person's always talking about so-and-so and you just got to get out of it, and you're trying to find a way, But you got to be holy, set apart. That means for God. Is that you're going to, that means about loving God, loving God more than you love people in many ways. So, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, self-controlled, holding to the faithful message. So that is the third thing in your outline. So you're blameless in your family life. You're blameless in your personal life if you're using your outline, and you are blameless in your doctrinal life. So I love this passage here. It's kind of awkwardly phrased. If you would, the Holy Spirit did it. So I'm the awkward one, not the Holy Spirit. But he talks about holding to the faithful message as taught. Holding to the faithful message as taught. It seems to me that he's speaking about stability in doctrine. He's not following every latest theological fad that's out there. He's not like doing the prayer of Jabez and all these different fads that come and go. He's always like following the nearest thing, the newest type of, spiritual initiative that's out there. That he has stability. That on the core things, he's still studying certain things that are not essential to the faith, but on the core things, it's solid. And that word mysterion, it's a unique word. It means something that only God can reveal. There are certain aspects of the self-authenticating work of the Holy Spirit that they do in our heart that just gives us a conviction that it's true, that we don't need a lot of extra external proofs. I mean, the self-authenticating work of the Holy Spirit is proof for you, and it's what God's going to hold you accountable to. So a person who is doctrinally stable, so because you're influencing people, you're taking them somewhere. We're taking everybody somewhere in that way. So not only the need for spiritual leadership, the character of spiritual leadership, but the practice of spiritual leadership. Verse 9, the second part of verse 9. Holding to the faithful message is taught so that, that's a hina clause there in Greek, just a little word that means because of this, right? So that he will be able both, there's two aspects of this, he will both be able to encourage with sound teaching. That sound teaching, health-giving teaching. It's a type of teaching that the Lord Jesus Christ himself brought to us. It brings us, it has a foundation to it. It's a type of teaching that doesn't ebb and flow with the culture. It doesn't ebb and flow with your feelings. It's sound. It brings spiritual health. Any type of doctrine that does not drive you and me, and this is so very important for all of it, if it doesn't drive you and me towards obeying God, run from it. If there's any type of idea out there that because you're saved, you can live any life you want to, there's no consequences, run from that. The Bible is written for the purpose of us striving and emulating the very character of God. You're not saved by your works, but God has saved you for good works. And that is the goal. And any teaching that does not have that up there as the pinnacle, the goal is to honor God with your lives, then run from it. I pray that that's what our church stands for, is this type of doctrine, this teaching. You got to be able to encourage people. That's interesting. I've said this before, but there is a time where you encourage people, but there's also a time where you have to refute people as well. If you love them, you'll refute people. This doesn't necessarily have to be the false teachers here in Crete. This can be believers. Listen, I want to love God. I want to love God more than I love you, because if I love God, I'm automatically going to love you, right? In that way. But also, too, I think that I have to care about loving you more than you liking me. I have to care about you more than you liking me. That means I'm going to have to say things. The elder's going to have to say things that maybe you didn't want to hear. Sometimes I'm going to have to say things that are going to challenge you. But who else is going to tell you if it's not a pastor or an elder? You have plenty of people in your life that will tell you what you want to hear. There's plenty of people that just tell you, oh, it's okay. They won't tell you, no, you need to stop doing this and you need to go in this direction. You need people to care more about you than they care about you liking them. That's difficult sometimes. You have to encourage people with sound teaching, and we have to refute those who contradict it. So what about you? Are you a leader worth following? When somebody comes around you, or you're interacting maybe with your kids, or maybe you're interacting with an employee, or maybe a coworker, maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's another church member, Do you remember that you're leading them, and you're either going to be leading them towards the things of God by your attitude, your actions, your thoughts, and your behaviors, or you're going to be leading them away from God by the way, even just by your example. You're a leader somewhere in your life. What kind of leader are you going to be? Are you going to be one worth following? That's what we want to be. It's so applicable to the church. The reason this is so applicable to the church is because Paul sets this up in Titus, because good examples within the church, not perfect examples, but good examples within the church, are the basis for which people grow. Because you and I don't have a lot of examples out there about what the Christian life looks like. A lot of our parents weren't walking with the Lord. I mean, we just sort of emulate what they did. A lot of the things, the environment that you grew up in oftentimes is not a good model. Maybe you didn't have a godly parent or a godly mother or a godly upbringing. So you don't even know what it looks like. And we're going to have lots of people coming into the church in that vein. Most of us here come from that kind of background. And so we need men and women to be examples, because all of us are leaders somewhere at some point, and we're all leading people somewhere. Are you a leader worth following? Am I a leader worth following? So Titus sets this down as the foundation. He knew that they have to be a good example. They're going to shoot themselves in the foot trying to plant a church if the leadership was just like the culture. Next week, he starts in verse 10, and he gives the reason for that. And he says, "For there are many rebellious people full of empty talk and deception." He goes, the reason that we need godly leadership in the church is because of what our culture is giving us, what our culture is doing. And so next week, we're going to look at that interaction of how leadership has an effect on a bad culture.